Hello and welcome to In Control, the first podcast on control theory. Here we discuss the science of feedback, decision-making, artificial intelligence, and much more.
To a mathematician, a matrix is a table of numbers which describes the relationships between the components of various kinds of systems.
I'm your host, Alberto Padoan, live from a recording studio in Zurich. Quick thanks to our sponsor, the NCCR Automation and the International Federation of Automatic Control. Our guest today is Cleve Moler, the world's first MATLAB programmer and co-founder of MathWorks. Cleve is a pioneering and legendary figure in numerical analysis. He's been a professor of mathematics and computer science at the University of Michigan, Stanford University, and the University of New Mexico. He's co-authored various mathematical software packages, LINPACK EISPACK, and 5 textbooks on numerical analysis. And he also co-founded, together with Jack Little, MathWorks, who popularized the software MATLAB. His work has been recognized by a number of awards, including the 2012 IEEE Computer Society Pioneer Award, 2014 IEEE John von Neumann Medal, and the 2017 Computer History Museum Fellow Award. He's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and has been past president of SIAM. Welcome to the show, Cleve.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent introduction. I wish my introductions were usually like that. Thank you.
So, Cleve, in this episode today, we're going to try and explore the origins, the challenges, and the triumphs that have shaped the extraordinary evolution of MATLAB. So, I'd like to take a chronological path, if possible.
Sure enough.
And so I'd like to start with the beginning. I should mention to our audience that we're going to base our discussion today on a paper that you wrote together with Jack Little called The History of MATLAB, published on the Proceedings of the ACM of Programming Languages in 2020, and also on your delightful blog, Cleve's Corner, that can be found at blogs.mathworks.com/Cleve, and many other videos that actually can be found online. So you grew up in Utah, is that correct? And I'm just wondering whether that actually affected you in some way, like the person that you actually became later.
Well, yes, I think so. I met Utah as back then a pretty isolated place. And, it's known as the home of the Mormons, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's a big Mormon temple in Zurich. I'm not Mormon. Most of my friends in high school were Mormons, but not me. The fact that when it came time to go to college, I knew I wanted to leave Utah, and my choices were MIT and Caltech. And I got admitted to both. I joked that I got admitted to Caltech because I was from Utah, and that was their idea of diversity back then. So I left Utah and have hardly been back since.
And you actually joined Caltech in 1957, right?
That's right. I arrived on the Caltech campus a week before the first Sputnik went up. And that was the beginning of the world's interest in science and an important event for us. We had, I first encountered computing at Caltech. We had a Burroughs 205 Datatron, one of just a few dozen electronic computers in Southern California at the time. And Professor John Todd at Caltech got me interested in numerical analysis and computing.
So when you were at Caltech, you were essentially already on a path to become a mathematician, or?
Well, I wasn't sure. Both my parents were journalists, and I thought I would become a science writer.
So what made you change your mind and continue on the computer science path? Was it John Todd?
Well, he was part of it. Actually, a freelance reporter whose name I don't remember visited Caltech and did a big article on Caltech for Fortune magazine. I was editor of the Caltech paper, student newspaper, and so that made me the contact for this guy for the students. And he asked me what I wanted to do, and I said I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be a science writer. And he says, well, my advice to you is to stay in school. This is the best time you have to learn, and stay in school. And you can always become a writer, but this is the best time you have to learn things. So that's why I stayed in mathematics, and I'm still there.
Would you give that advice to students also today?
Absolutely. When they ask me what the advice for young people, I say, stay in school. MathWorks will offer you a job. Don't take it. Stay in school as long as you can.
I should mention that, so previously you mentioned John Todd. So John Todd was an Irish mathematician who actually studied in Cambridge under Hardy and Littlewood, and is credited with basically saving Oberwalfach. You also mentioned that you were working on the Burrs 205 Datatron.
Yes.
I read in an interview that you dubbed it a personal computer, but not in the way we normally intended.
Well, yes, it filled a room. It filled an entire room. It operated on vacuum tubes. I don't know how many of your listeners remember vacuum tube, but this was before the transistor era. And the computer filled the room, but only one person could use it at a time. We had to sign up for time in half-hour chunks. And maybe 2:30 in the morning, we'd get our time on the computer.
And so basically, you had to use that computer for one of Todd's assignments. Is that right? Or
that's right, correct.
And so I was reading that you actually basically developed a project on Hilbert matrices.
That's right. I mean, we did very simple things on the computer then. We didn't have an assembler. We didn't have a compiler. We punched our programs on paper tape. And but yes, I did some computation with matrices, but I started with Todd.
And so under his suggestion, you then moved to Stanford in 1961. Is that correct?
Todd, his wife, Olga Towsky, who was another mathematician at Caltech, had been part of the Institute for Numerical Analysis, the INA, at UCLA, around one of the first computers in this country, at the SWAC. Another member of INA had been George Forsythe. The INA was dissolved in the early 1950s, and the Todds went to Caltech, and Forsythe went to Stanford. So Todd advised me to go to Stanford to work with his friend George Forsythe. I did that.
And so did you know George Forsythe also before?
No, I didn't. He was a mathematics professor. He was a professor in the math department at Stanford in 1961 when I got there, but he was in the process of forming the computer science department, the world famous Stanford Computer Science Department. He started in 1965. So I went to Stanford as a graduate student in mathematics, but by the time I left there 4 years later, I was an instructor in the new computer science department.
So Forsythe was actually your doctoral advisor?
That's correct. Yes.
And you were working on computing eigenvalues of the Laplace equation on two-dimensional domains, right?
Boy, you've really done your homework. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, because I was very curious about what you were actually working on and the origin of, I've seen a fantastic anecdote on the origin of the logo of MATLAB, and I think I should let you explain that. It's wonderful.
Well, yes, what is now the MathWorks logo, this kind of orange or gold shaped is mathematically a solution to the wave equation. We're the only company in the world that has a solution to a partial differential equation as its logo. But that was an example that I used in my thesis. It was an important problem that Forsythe and others had worked on before me. So that became sort of my symbol, and eventually, years later, would become the MathWorks logo.
Yeah, so that was actually the main example of your thesis I was reading. So an L-shaped membrane, and basically we were simulating how the heat equation would propagate in this domain.
Well, the wave equation describes the movement, the vibration. If that were, you can think of that as a membrane stretched across an L-shaped region, like you had a towel on the beach, but a picnic basket on one corner of the towel. How would it blow in the wind? And that's what we're simulating.
Then, of course, the logo changed over the years, and now it's in color. It has a different shape, I suppose, with respect to the first logo, but the idea is the same.
Yes, that's right. The mathematics is the same.
So I was actually reading another curious anecdote about your PhD. So about your final oral exam of your PhD defense. I read that they were not super nice in terms of questions about group theory and topology.
Where did you read that? Is that written down someplace?
Yes. So there's like an oral transcription of an interview that I found online. I'll be happy to send it to you.
No, probably. There's a long oral history that was recorded by a computing historian, a mathematics historian named Hay, and there's a SIAM collection of oral histories.
Yeah, I did read that too, and it was super fascinating.
Yes, the short version of the story is that there was some confusion as to what constituted a final oral exam. Forsythe had told me it was a defensive thesis, and I just had to know the mathematics that was in my thesis. But other members of the committee had the idea that anything I had studied as a grad student was fair game. And so they started asking me questions about Lie groups. I had taken a course in Lie groups and I'd forgotten all about it. I'm usually pretty confident in those kinds of things, but that was an unpleasant day for me. I passed the exams, but only after they discussed what should be on the exam.
Basically, what I see is that after your PhD is you move on to Zurich. So you actually come to Switzerland?
That's right. Also at the Institute of Numerical Analysis, the INA in UCLA, a Swiss mathematician by the name of Stiefel, famous Swiss mathematician Stiefel, had been at the INA and had established relationships with the U.S. Office of Naval Research. So the Office of Naval Research had a postdoctoral fellowship to study at the Institute for Angewandte Mathematik at the ETH. And came on that fellowship in 1965, an important year in Zurich. The names there were Rudeshauser and Stiefel and Rizzi were the famous professors at the ETH at the time. They're no longer with us.
Yeah, they're all giants in the field. I should mention to our audience that, Stiefel is credited with at least co-inventing the conjugate gradient method.
Right.
Together with Magnus Hessenes.
Correct.
He also has a manifold title to him, the Stiefel manifold.
That's right.
And I read in a past interview that you mentioned that Stiefel was the epitome of the classic German Herr Professor Doctor.
Oh, yes.
What does that mean?
Well, he was a real... he was not actually a pleasant man. He ruled as the head of this institute. There was the blackboards, I think they still have it in Swiss universities, have chalk, white chalk, and you get your hands dirty. And so there are wash basins everywhere so you can wash the chalk off their hands. I don't know if they still have those.
They're still there, I can confirm.
And at the computer center, there were 2 wash basins. There was a wash basin and 2 towels hanging on the wall. And one towel was labeled Der Chef, the chief, and that was Stiefel's towel, and everybody else used the other towel.
Wow.
Stiefel was a member of the Zurich City Council, and very autocratic, powerful individual, yes.
A very influential figure.
Yes. And Rizzi was another famous professor, and Rizzi had spent 13 years at UCLA and had been called back to Switzerland, so he was Americanized. And Rudeshauser was, at the time, the most famous mathematician, helped start computer science. But by the time I got to Zurich, Rudeshauser was ill, so I didn't see much of him. What was interesting about the institute there is that, you actually saw very little of these 3 famous professors. but they had accumulated some assistants and visitors, people from other parts of the world. And so you got to know these relatively young people and establish professional relationships with them that last for a long time.
What were you studying when you were here in Zurich?
Well, I was still working on the L-shaped membrane, actually. My thesis had been about finite difference methods and why they are slow. And while I was in Zurich, with Henrizi's help, I developed a new method that could compute the eigenvalues, eigenfunctions very accurately and very quickly. And that was done while I was in Zurich.
Yeah, I think I noted down actually in my notes that this paper is approximation and bounds for eigenvalues of elliptic operators. Of course, there will be links in the description of the podcast to all these papers. And another anecdote that I wrote down about this specific paper is that on your Christmas tree, you had a little L-shaped membrane that you made out of tinfoil. Is that right?
That's correct. I did the computation. The computations that we described, I was doing on the computer in Zurich, and I got the first results just before Christmas, and I was very excited about it. So I made that little L-shaped membrane to ornament. The first eigenvalue, the number I computed, is 9.6397283235. So that's an important number in my life. If you just remember those digits, they're the password to my garage and my bank account, and my phone.
And so this is 1965.
Yes, correct.
So you're still a grad student. And so something that I didn't understand.
Postdoc.
A postdoc, of course. But as a grad student, I was reading that you also took part to some conferences organized at Argonne or at the University of Michigan.
No, that was later. There was a conference organized in Gatlinburg, Tennessee by Alston Householder from Oak Ridge in the University of Tennessee. And I got to go to that. It was an invited conference by invitation only, and there was only a few dozen researchers there, and I got to go there as a graduate student. Those conferences continued every 4 years. It's still going now. There's been about 20 of them, and I've been to all of them except one. They were originally in Gatlinburg, but then at other places around the world. We had one in Bavaria organized by Professor Bauer from Munich, and they're important gatherings of people in numerical linear algebra particularly.
I mean, these are the world famous, at least for those who are in the numerical linear algebra realm, Householder meetings, Householder conferences.
That's right.
So there were people of the caliber of Householder, Jim Wilkinson, Givens, Richard Varga. So these are all legendary figures in numerical analysis.
That's right. That's where I first met Wilkinson, who was an important mentor of mine. After Zurich, my first permanent position as a professor was in Michigan, University of Michigan. And there was a summer conference that had been already started. And when I got to Michigan, I took over organizing the summer conference. And that's where Wilkinson and Householder and Varga, Todd used to come and lecture during the summer.
Again, I should mention for context to our audience that Wilkinson collaborated with Turing in the ACE computer project. He's famous for many contributions to mathematics. There's even a Wilkinson polynomial. He received the Turing Award in 1970. And you said that he was a mentor. Did you actually collaborate with him?
Yes. Oh, yes. I worked with him a lot. I visited his home. And Argonne Laboratory is a U.S. national lab outside of Chicago. We used to go there every summer and do research on software for matrix computations. And Wilkinson was the inspiration of that and would visit there every summer. So I got to know him and work with him, write a paper with him.
And Argonne, I believe, is actually where the inception of the EISPACK project and the LINPACK project are?
Right. EISPACK stands for Eigensystem Package. Wilkinson and a number of other colleagues had written research papers about how to solve linear systems and compute eigenvalues of matrices that were published in Numerische Mathematik, the German math journal. These were programs in the Algol language, which, by the way, had been essentially invented by Rudeshauser, was one of the people who was involved in the inception of the Algol. They were collected in a book by Wilkinson and Christian Reintz from Zurich. And the EISPACK project was a project to translate the Algol into Fortran so everybody could use it. That was followed by the LINPACK project, which was a program developed software for solving linear equations. And so by the early 1970s, LINPACK and EISPACK were together represented the state of the art for solving dense systems of matrices, involving dense matrices.
And you were then already a professor at the University of Michigan. And I've noted down that in 1967, there is also this publication called Computer Solutions of Linear Algebraic Systems, which was, as I mentioned, published in 1967 together with Forsythe, where you basically give detail about these sort of programs. Were they also written in Algol or in other languages?
There were programs in 3 languages there: Algol, Fortran, and a language called PL1, which everybody thought was going to be the future of computing, but was just so complicated that we don't use it today.
I should mention that also this publication has been recognized as one of the 20 most influential textbooks from the Association of Computing Machinery in the history of computing, to its early emphasis on software. And so, can you tell us a little bit more about the EISPACK project and also the LINPACK project and your involvement in those?
So the EISPACK project was a project centered at Argonne, involving production of what became the EISPACK collection library for eigenvalue computations. The people working on that project were all at Argonne Laboratory: Brian Smith, Jim Boyle, Bert Garbo, and a young student named Jack Dungara was involved in that. I would visit Argonne this summer and work on that project and as I say, Wilkinson was there as an advisor. That was followed by the LINPACK project, which was to write a collection of programs for solving linear equations. That was not a translation of any Algol. That was written from scratch. And the principal authors, the authors of LINPACK, were myself, Dungara at Argonne, and then Pete Stewart from the University of Maryland and Jim Bunch from UC San Diego. And the 3 of us were faculty members, would all gather at Argonne in the summer and work with Dungara to produce LINPACK.
May I ask what were actually the big problems out there to be solved? So I imagine like eigenvalue computations.
Well, all the computers, any computer center at the time had software for solving linear equations, for solving AX equals B. There were many different computers, many operating systems, many formats for floating point words. So there was no standard for solving linear equations. The methods for solving eigenvalues were not well established until Wilkinson's work. And there were other kinds of algorithms that are essentially based on the characteristic polynomial that didn't work so well. And it was Wilkinson's work with the QR algorithm that established it as the way to compute eigenvalue problems.
That's actually incredible, because these are things that I guess students of my age take for granted. But it's incredible that just a few years back, these things were actually the core of the research in numerical analysis.
That's right. The singular value decomposition was known theoretically when I was a graduate student, but we didn't know how to compute it. And Forsythe said one day, why doesn't somebody figure out how to compute the darn thing? And Gene Golub at Stanford together with Velvo Kahn and Christian Reinsch, developed the algorithm that we still use today for computing the singular value decomposition. So that was new when I was beginning this process.
Something else that I noted down about EISPACK, and then maybe we can actually move on to the inception of MATLAB, was that, first of all, it was stored on magnetic tapes, from what I see. And also, it's essentially an ancestor of open source code, because your purpose was actually to disseminate the code.
That's right, yes. Both of those things are right. Magnetic tape and open source. It wasn't called that back then, but...
Incredible.
You can still get EISPACK code and LINPACK code from the internet by going to a place called MATLAB, which Don Guerra had started, which is a collection of now sort of old Fortran. And both LINPACK and EISPACK, the original code is there.
So I should mention also that Jack Donguera is another legendary figure in the field of parallel computing. Maybe this is actually a good moment to mention the inception of MATLAB. I noted down that in 1977, you were a professor at University of New Mexico and you were teaching linear algebra. And it basically started as a hobby. Am I right?
Yes. I was wanted to have my students have... I was teaching numerical analysis and linear algebra in the math department at the University of New Mexico. I wanted to have my students have access to LINPACK and EISPACK without writing Fortran programs. So I wrote the first version of MATLAB as just a simple matrix calculator. It had only about 80 functions. It didn't have it didn't have differential equations. It didn't have FFT, didn't have any graphics. It wasn't programmable. It wasn't really a computer language. It was just a calculator. But the important thing, it was interactive. You could sit at a terminal and type in statements and get the results right away, which was a vast improvement over submitting card decks to the computer center. So it was interactive. And it did have the SVD in it. So that was a new capability that most people didn't have in their libraries at home and in other libraries. MATLAB turned out to be useful for other things other than just the simple calculations I intended my students to use. And in early 1980s, a control engineer by name of Jack Little got the old Fortran MATLAB and started doing his work on control theory using MATLAB. And that eventually led to the foundation of MathWorks, the company to produce MATLAB, the commercial version of MATLAB.
I noted down a couple of things about what you call classic MATLAB in the paper, A History of MATLAB. So first of all, I noted down that the backslash operator was already there, that of used for solving a set of linear equation, the colon operator for indexing, and especially the Y command, which survives today. And so for those who haven't interacted with MATLAB before, it's a command that returns a random response for a fixed list of predefined answers, such as some old and nearly bald mathematician suggested it. And it's still there today.
Well,
right?
It's more than a fixed response. There have been two versions of the Y command. My original Y command did have 10 fixed responses. But then a friend of mine named Bill McKeeman, who is a computer language expert, rewrote a Y command when he wanted to learn MATLAB. And today it generates arbitrarily long syntax. It's sort of a predecessor of, this occurred to me. The Y command is a predecessor of ChatGPT and the chat bots.
I was about to mention that actually. So can we expect ChatGPT to interact with the Y command at some point?
I didn't think about that till just then. Yes.
Maybe I'd like to dig a little bit more into the Stanford course that you actually delivered in between 1978 and 79, because that actually then led to the birth of MathWorks. So you were teaching there a graduate course in numerical analysis, and this is where you were using your own MATLAB, the classic MATLAB.
So I was a visiting professor at Stanford for that academic year, 79. I taught the graduate numerical analysis class, and I used this MATLAB calculator. The students did their homework with MATLAB. Half the students, there were a couple dozen, there may be 24 students in the class. Half of them were math and computer science, and they weren't very impressed with MATLAB. It was not new numerical analysis. It was not new computer science. But the other half of the students were for engineering, and they were studying things that I didn't know anything about at the time, like control theory, your specialty here of this podcast, system theory, signal processing, and they loved MATLAB, and they started using it in their work. One of those students in the class showed Jack Little MATLAB. Little didn't take this class, but his friend did, and that's where Little learned about MATLAB, was from that class. And that eventually led to the establishment of MathWorks 3 years later.
I mean, the 80s were definitely the golden age of robustness and robust control for us. State space methods were there and heavily relied on computations that involved linear algebra. So it must have looked like gold, at least to Jack Little, to see such type of software. I was actually curious, did you already have algorithms for the solution, say, of Cauchy equations, or was that developed later?
No, that's control theory. That's not numerical linear algebra. And I didn't know what the Riccati equation was when I wrote MATLAB.
And so in 1983, I noted down that Little suggested creating a commercial product based on MATLAB, as you say. And so a little while later, so in 1984, December 7th, MathWorks was incorporated in California, and it was you, Jack Little, and Bangert.
Steve Bangert. Little and Bangert. So my first what we now call classic MATLAB, that MATLAB calculator, was written in Fortran. Little threw all my code away and rewrote everything in C, which was a gutsy thing to do at the time because C had not been used for any big numerical project then. And Little and Bangert rewrote MATLAB, introduced M files, introduced functions, introduced some primitive graphics. Little wrote the first control toolbox. Little wrote the first signal processing toolbox.
And presumably C at the time was pretty recent as a language, right?
That's right. An important thing also, this was the time the PC came out. The PC, when it first came out, didn't have enough memory, wasn't fast enough to do much with MATLAB. But Little anticipated that eventually the PC would become the dominant tool that we now all use today. And so the fact that MATLAB was on the PC and was interactive, that's what contributed to its popularity.
And I was actually very pleased to read that PC MATLAB was actually launched at the 23rd IEEE Conference on Decision and Control in Las Vegas in 1984. So it was a control conference.
That's correct, yes. Numerical linear algebra and the numerical analysis, that was my business, but that was not a commercially viable place to do to start software. We could not make any money trying to do just numerical linear algebra to universities. So the use in engineering, also in universities, but then by companies, automobile companies and so on, was important. And that's where Little got us started.
Also, I read somewhere that Nick Trefethen of MIT was the first person to actually buy a copy of MATLAB. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct. Nick Trefethen had been in that class in 1979 at Stanford and had seen the original MATLAB. He's one of the people I said wasn't so impressed with it. He now says he was impressed with it at the time, but that's maybe in hindsight. But so he knew about MATLAB, and he became a professor at MIT. He's now just retired from Oxford. I'm going to his retirement conference in August this year, And Trefethen bought the first MATLAB, commercial MATLAB, for his class at MIT. We have a copy of his purchase order, framed copy of the purchase order somewhere at MathWorks. And Trefethen also had a copy of his purchase order in his office at Oxford.
I should mention also that Nick Trefethen is also another giant in the field of numerical linear algebra. I will, of course, put a link in the description or in the show notes of this podcast.
Actually, the best way today to compute the eigenvalues of the L-shaped membrane is a method developed by Trefethen. So,
as you mentioned, so Jack Little was the person who wrote the first version of the control system toolbox, and that was released in 1985. And I also noted down that another, at least for us, giant in control theory, so Leonard Leung, wrote the System Identification Toolbox in 1988.
That's correct.
And that was essentially to accompany his textbook on the subject. So that probably also contributed to popularizing MATLAB within our community.
Leonard Leung wrote his textbook. John Doyle was involved in MATLAB at the very beginning. Ostrom was also involved.
John Doyle was actually on our podcast, literally the episode before this.
Oh, really?
So, yes. And we actually talked about him contributing to developing the robust control toolbox. So it's fantastic. Basically, what I see is that slowly MATLAB takes off. So you start increasing, for a moment at least, exponentially the number of employees.
Well, it's still growing exponentially. But for the first 7 years, MATLAB doubled in size every year. So it started with 1 employee, namely Little, then 2, Little and Bangert. And I didn't join the company for 5 years. I was off doing other stuff involving parallel computing and Silicon Valley. But I was an advisor to the company, and I joined the company full-time in 1989, when it had 2 to the 5th employees, 32 employees. We're still growing exponentially, but not doubling every year. Now it takes us about 5 or 6 years to double the size. The company is now up to 6,000 people worldwide. Offices in about 24 different cities around the world have MATLAB offices. Little is still CEO. Little was CEO when he was the only employee, and he's now CEO when the company has 6,000 employees. We're going to celebrate our 40th anniversary next year. And so that's a phenomenal achievement for a company to last that long and for one guy to be CEO that long.
Can I ask actually, when was Simulink added to MATLAB?
Simulink, I think, came about 1989, 1990, somewhere around then. I'm not a Simulink expert, so I don't remember exactly. The first versions of Simulink were done by Joe Hicklin and Andy Grace at MathWorks.
That must have been a big deal for control engineers, essentially, because we work extensively with block diagrams. So having that kind of interface is huge.
That's right. Yes, it is. Yes.
And since you basically joined MathWorks full time, then you started focusing on parallel computing and parallel MATLAB. Is that when the term embarrassingly parallel came out, or?
Well, no, actually the embarrassingly parallel came out even before MathWorks. That was back when I was working at Intel on the first commercial parallel computer, and I wrote a paper there that introduced embarrassingly parallel as a term for it's the way most parallel computing is done today. You have dozens or hundreds of separate jobs to do, a parameter sweep or processing images, a collection of images or something like that. And you can do all the calculations simultaneously on separate machines or on separate cores, and then combine the results at the end. And so it's embarrassing because there's no science behind the parallelization there.
Yeah, I should mention that there's also another delightful blog post on your Cleve's Corner about this topic. Again, I will put a link in the description of the podcast for those who are interested. I just wanted to dig into an episode that I found from 1992 related to the Pentium FDIV bug. I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Boy, you found you've done an incredible job working on this.
Thanks.
So in 1994, the internet, we had the internet. We did not yet have internet browsers. We didn't have Google. We just had news groups, which were mailing lists for specialists involved in various topics. I mean, there was a MATLAB news group, and I don't know if there was a control news group, maybe, but we were using Intel chips. Then Intel came out with the Pentium chip, which was the next in their evolution of chips. A professor named...
I think I noted down Thomas Nicely.
Nicely, yes. Was doing some calculations on prime numbers and discovered that the Pentium had a bug in its division instruction. And this created a stir on the internet. There was news stories, and I became a kind of spokesman about the bug. I didn't discover it, but I wrote about it in these news groups and eventually was in the New York Times and so on about the FDIV bug. Intel's customers were computer companies. Intel didn't sell to individuals, they sold to these companies. And they had already knew about this bug and had fixed it in a later stepping of the chip. They didn't think it was such a big deal, but when the internet began to complain about it, Intel was reluctant to replace the chip. And when the internet complained about that, it took a while for Intel to get on board.
So I noted down that there was a release of MATLAB called Pentium Aware Release. So version 4.2c2,
right,
which was made available to users. And then basically this was actually a fantastic springboard for MATLAB itself to be advertised on the New York Times. Presumably this was a great advertisement for you guys.
That's right. So MATLAB, the software was known, but MathWorks, the company, was not well known. And when a news release came out that this obscure company in Massachusetts had a workaround for the FDIV bug, that helped make the world aware of the company.
As you mentioned, today MathWorks counts up to 6,000 people as employees. It's used by more than 7,000 colleges and universities around the world. And I was reading at the end of this paper, so in the history of MATLAB, that you speculate that the success of MATLAB itself was not due to the fact that it was designed for signal processing or any other subject, but to do good mathematics. Is that right?
Well, yes, that's kind of a flamboyant statement, but it was good mathematics. Well, specialized mathematics. I mean, matrix computation is not all of mathematics. It's a very small part of it. But the fact that that was interactive, that the language was easily used, and that people found it, developed specialized packages in control theory and all kinds of other places. That's why it's found its use. It's incredible. Every day I learn about some new use of MATLAB. Not every day, but every few weeks. And that's what I enjoy about what I do, is learn about new uses of MATLAB.
That's amazing. So something that we didn't talk about until now is your involvement with SIAM. So SIAM is the Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics. You've been the president of the society. Nowadays it counts quite a few journals on applied mathematics. And I was wondering whether you can tell us something about that.
You know, there are three big professional societies in mathematics in the United States. The American Math Society is far and away the biggest one. And that's pure mathematicians, theoretical mathematicians, academic mathematicians. The Math Association is concerned about mathematics education. And then SIAM is wants to set aside industrial and applied mathematics. And I've been involved in SIAM. It's been part of my professional life ever since I started. I've been on the council and the board of trustees, and I edited a SIAM journal. SIAM publishes journals. That's its main business. And I don't know, now there are maybe 24 journals. There's a SIAM journal of control and a SIAM journal of numerical analysis, and lots of other specialized SIAM journals.
Well, on one of these journals, I noted down that you wrote an extremely popular article called 19 Dubious Ways to Compute the Exponential of a Matrix with Charlie Van Loan, another legend in linear algebra. And I was wondering whether you can tell us something about that too.
That actually, I got involved in that. It actually goes back again to Zurich and then Rizzi in a way. So that was a review article. That was in SIAM's review journal, which means it isn't research, but it's collecting together, summarizing results in a field. And the title, 19 Dubious Ways, contributed to its popularity. So, yes, that talked about the effect of computer round-off error on algorithms for computing matrix exponential. We published it in SIAM Review, and then 25 years later, it was published again with some additional material.
So what is today the best way to compute the exponential of a matrix?
The best way is to use the software that's available in MATLAB and available elsewhere in other computer languages by Nick Higham, the other Nick from England. There's Nick Tafethan and Nick Higham. And Higham is now the world's leading authority on computing e to the a. And so his method is based on, was method 3 of the 19 dubious ways. It's called scaling and squaring. So that's the best way to solve it, is to use Higham function.
Nick Higham is again another legendary figure in applied mathematics. He's written a book called Functions of Matrices, Theory and Computation. Again, I'll put a link in the description for those who are interested. So since we're approaching the end of this episode, Cleve, I'd like to ask you, what do you see as the future of applied mathematics?
The future of applied mathematics, I have no idea. We continue to work on things. At MathWorks, we have dozens of projects going on by individual experts in the field and developing toolboxes for the dozens of different businesses we're in. We'll continue to develop work on this toolbox, biomathematics, genetics, biomechanics, specialized things in control. If you're working on a cell phone equipment and want to conform to the standards for 5G, that you use a MATLAB toolbox to test your cell phone equipment against the standard. So on and on. That's the future of MathWorks, is continue to develop the things we're developing. We have lots of work to do.
On a different note, maybe, so in closing this episode, something that I'd like to ask to every person that features on this podcast is advice to future students. So I was wondering whether there's anything that you've learned over the years that you would suggest to somebody approaching, say, the applied mathematics or control field.
Well, my glib answer, and it's serious, is to stay in school as long as you can afford it. It's the time you have to learn. The importance of computing. I've been involved with computers all my life, all my professional life. What's interesting today is how much computers affect everybody else. My mother-in-law looking for a new hearing aid. My wife's shopping for groceries. I use the internet to book airplane travel and all this going on. It's incredible what it's done for us. And then GPS and Google and so on. Mathematics is actually a minor part of that. Studying mathematics, you learn how to work on things, learn how to understand new things. And so learning how to learn is important. if what you do, you go to graduate school and you write a thesis, you're unlikely to continue to work on what your thesis is about. What you will do is work on new things using the techniques to study and to investigate that you learned in grad school.
Another question that I have before closing this episode, mindful also of your time, is what are for you the must-read classics in applied mathematics? And if there's anyone, what is your favorite theorem?
Oh my goodness, my favorite theorem. It's been so long since I thought in terms of theorems. The Perron-Frobenius theorem is a beautiful theorem about the location of eigenvalues. The Gershgorin's theorem about, I'll tell you one story. So taking numerical analysis from Todd at Caltech, he was trying to talk about the Gershgorin theorem. You have these disks, and the disks contain the eigenvalues. And he came to the question of when are the eigenvalues actually on the boundary of the disks? And he had trouble getting that straight. And he said, well, came to the end of the class, and he'll say, well, we'll talk about that on Friday. On Friday, his wife came in. His wife was Olga Towsky, and she was the one who had written the theorem for the Gershgorins, when Gershgorin is on the boundary of the disks. So Todd's wife finished the topic for us.
Another giant in the field of mathematics. We'll put a link to her Wikipedia page as well. Well, on behalf of our small community, thanks a lot for everything that you've done, Cleve. It's been a real pleasure to have you on this show.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be on the show and to see all the work you've done in preparing for it. Very few people know as much about my life as you do right now. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for listening. I hope you liked the show today. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow us on Spotify, support on Patreon or PayPal, and connect with us on social media platforms. See you next time.